Well, welcome everybody. This is a brand new webinar series, and it's presented in partnership with Level Up Fargo and Matto Foundation, where they are working together alongside Dakota Medical Foundation to delay, to decrease, and defeat substance abuse and addiction. So this is part of a free monthly series. It's designed to address youth substance use and the challenging issues around young people are facing, especially during a time of uncertainty. So this is the first one. This will be the first Thursday of each month at noon. And these are going to be hour-long discussions. And if you're a coach, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you are a concerned adult in the community about the livelihoods of our youth and where they're going, you're going to learn from local experts and leaders. And we're going to get some resources about how we can delay, decrease, and defeat substance abuse, particularly among young people. So be sure to follow Level Up Fargo and Matto Foundation on Facebook. That's going to be your go-to information source is Facebook, Level Up Fargo, and also the Matto Foundation to get this resource and share it, and also to keep track of oncoming and new resources that are going to be available to you. Before we really dive into this webinar, I want to introduce Andrea, who helps Dakota Medical Foundation's prevention efforts to help end addiction through Level Up Fargo and Matto Foundations. Andrea.
Hi, thank you, Scott. A great introduction. I'm very excited to get this webinar kicked off. I am, very interested in hearing what Nicole has to say. I know she has some great tips for us on how to navigate this seemingly intimidating drug talk. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you have any questions during today's webinar, please feel free to enter them in the chat. We will be monitoring those, and then we will answer them at the end of toward the end of the meeting. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Well, I'm so excited to introduce our first guest expert, and we couldn't have anybody better to help kick this series off than Nicole Leitner. She is she's going to share incredible tips. And the one thing about Nicole, I know her personally, is that you can ask any question. So if you're watching this and you're a parent, you're a coach, you're a concerned adult, you got a real question, you may even be intimidated to ask, we will keep you anonymous and we can read your question. And you can mark that again in the chat box, but she is not afraid of any questions and she has seen it all. She works at the North Dakota East Central Juvenile Court as a court officer supervisor. And so you can see her title there. They keep it very fancy over there as Court Officer 3 in the North Dakota Juvenile Court Unit 2. So if you want some specificity. But here's the thing about Nicole, 25 years of juvenile court experience. She serves on the Level Up Fargo Coalition. She's a member of the Matto Foundation Board, and she's a mom of 2 teens. So she gets this. In addition to seeing scores and scores and scores of other kids going through substance abuse battles and behavior challenges, Nicole is a mom. So she knows this from the science side of this, and she knows this from the practical living side of it. Nicole, welcome to this first webinar series from Level Up Fargo talking about substance abuse among young people.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Well, to kick things off, Nicole, what we're going to start with is, what age should we start talking about drugs and alcohol with our kids, or with, in our care for parents or for coaches? When do we start this conversation?
I think it should be just always an ongoing conversation. I think that it even starts when your kids are little and explaining to them about medications and why we take medications and what they do and how they affect you. We are seeing more and more kids at juvenile court that their age of first usage is, 12 or younger. I think that many people think it's a high school problem or a late middle school problem, but they're hearing about it from older peers, older siblings, other parents. My advice to parents always is you want it to hear it from you first. So just kind of having that ongoing conversation, making it be just very normal and very familiar. So the younger you start it, the less it has to be quote unquote awkward teenage conversation. It's just something we've always talked about and just always been open about. Not hiding if you have a beer at home, talking about why you shouldn't drink till you're 21, just having a normal conversation about it.
Well, and Nicole, what, and you're very good at this and you're skilled at this. So for us that are, finding this an awkward conversation, especially for having this, let's say with somebody 2 or 3 or a little bit younger, what are some ways we can start that conversation?
I think that being sure that, I think when you talk about awkward conversations, the word conversation to me is always not necessarily the word that I would choose in how you have difficult talks with your kids. I think that all kinds of topics, us as parents, you always have that dreaded sex talk, right? And you start sweating and, thinking about what you're going to say. I prefer to use that you have an opportunity for 30-second sound bites their entire life. And so don't view this as a conversation. View this as every opportunity you can. If a kid asks questions when they're 3 years old, answer them. Like, what's that, mommy? What's that, daddy? What are you taking? Being just open to not shutting them down about conversations. That's the biggest thing is when questions arise, make sure that they don't feel like it's a topic that can't be talked about and discussed.
Well, those are 2 excellent tips. I mean, instead of just focusing on having a conversation, particularly when they're younger, it's more about the message we want to send them about drugs and alcohol and what substance abuse looks like. And then 2, seeing that this is something we do on an ongoing basis. So I happen to know you've got a pretty great strategy, which has to do with getting your kids in the van. So what does it look like when you pick up your kids and we're now sealed in the vault of the minivan? What happens there and what does it look like?
Right. I've shared the story with Scott, so he knows kind of my tactic as a parent. So you find yourself often when your kids are younger, doing carpool. You do carpool to various events, birthday parties, that type of stuff. Carpools are the most opportunity you will ever have as a parent to pick up on little conversations. So I would encourage everybody when you're doing carpool to turn down the radio and listen to what's talking about in the back of your minivan. So I shared the story about my son and his baseball team. And I had 7 boys crammed into my minivan, and we were heading to Breckenridge, an hour away for a baseball. I overhear a conversation, and they were middle school, probably 13, 14 at this time. I overhear a conversation about somebody saying that they heard that so-and-so got busted for weed. So I piped up and said, let's talk about weed. Let's have a conversation about weed and what it does to the adolescent brain. So a 30-second little conversation and intro with them about how, and for those that are on here, I'm big on the brain science of marijuana. And I don't argue with people about whether or not a 25-year-old should smoke marijuana. Lots of, people are pro marijuana and recreational marijuana. But for the brain of an adolescent, that until it's fully developed, marijuana will stop its development. So I do a little brief talking to kid conversation about if you start smoking weed when you're 14, your brain gets to stay like a 14-year-old, and just making it very concrete, not getting into all the deep science. But so we had a whole conversation about marijuana. They asked me lots of questions and took that as an opportunity to just have a conversation. They were trapped in my van for an hour. And so they didn't have a chance to run away from me. And it was a very engaging conversation. So like I said, I didn't go into my 2-hour brain presentation with them. I just said, your brain is going to stay like a 14-year-old. And marijuana is not going to motivate you to be successful. Marijuana is not going to motivate you to be a better baseball player. Having all of those conversations with those kids. I had several of the parents thank me for that conversation. So That's the other thing. If you're a parent or somebody who's comfortable with that conversation, I joke all the time that awkward conversations with teenagers is kind of my jam. It's kind of my life. So I take every opportunity I can to help out another parent with an awkward conversation if need be.
Well, we're so appreciative of your skills and experience in that area, and also so grateful that you could join us to share some of that with us today. So, we've got this, we could start early. There's some great research. I mean, if we start early, this could reduce substance abuse by 40%, just getting starting the conversation early, and maybe even not even focusing just on conversation, but sharing the message. But you just mentioned something really insightful, which is, and I think this links to delay. And, the conversation a lot of parents seem to be framing this is like a marijuana or is drinking okay universally? Is it okay or is it not okay? But you just mentioned something interesting. It's the adolescent brain that we're concerned about. It's loss of potential. So if you care about your son or daughter's future and their potential and what they'll do. So what is happening? Could you share a little bit more? And I know you're an extensive expert on this, but just what's happening in the adolescent brain if they start to use drugs and alcohol at an earlier age?
Sure. So the brain itself doesn't really stop developing about between the ages of 22 and 25. So everybody's brain is trying to become better at making choices, for lack of a better term. So as the brain is developing, we're trying to build a strong frontal lobe. So it's kind of the kids nowadays, they know about the adolescent brain and they're like, oh, my frontal lobe isn't fully developed, which is accurate. And so the part of the brain that you get information, you process that information, and you make better choices the older you get. And so this is an ongoing process. The brain of a 17-year-old is better developed than the brain of a 12-year-old. And those of us that are parents, obviously you see that and how that transpires in them. So as your brain is developing, it's getting faster and faster, because what we want is we want the information to enter their brain and it immediately get to the frontal lobe so we can make a better conscious decision about our choices. Sometimes when I talk to parents or adults, I'll ask them, did you ever do anything as a kid that could have got you in legal trouble? And most of us are like, yeah, probably. But then when I ask, would you do that today at 46 years old? Well, no. And when you try to figure out why is that, it's because my brain is easier able to weigh the pros and cons of the consequences of those actions without putting a lot of thought into it. And that's the brain we want these kids to develop. We want them to develop the brain that a bad idea pops into their head, it immediately gets to their frontal lobe and they're like, whoa, dumb idea, right? But these kids, it takes a while to get to their lesser developed frontal lobe in the first place. And when I work with kids, I'll say, did you ever do anything? And a half hour later, you're like, wow, I really shouldn't have done that. And so when I talk to kids about like marijuana, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help kids develop a brain that processes information as fast as possible so that they have the better potential to make good choices. Because kids don't like sometimes their impulsive, reckless choices that they make, but they can't figure out why they did it. And why they did it is because the information takes a while to get to the part of the brain that helps you make the decision. So if you're 14 and you start smoking marijuana, because marijuana loves fat cells, the two worst substances for kids to use for their brain development are opiates and marijuana, because they love fat. So they attach to your fat cells, and your brain is 60% fat. So when you use marijuana, it sits in your brain for an extended period of time. And while it's in your brain, you don't develop. So all of those things that you're trying to do, all the gray matter that's trying to be produced to make you have a faster brain that makes better choices, stalls out. Well, at some point, your brain's going to stop developing no matter how much damage you did to it. So between 22 and 25, it's not like your brain at 25 goes, whoa, they smoked a lot of weed in junior high. We better keep working here and developing. It's going to just stop. So you lose all of those years. So in reality, if somebody starts smoking marijuana at 14 and smokes marijuana consistently until they're 22 years old, their brain will remain a 14-year-old. So the way their brain processes information will be slower. Their frontal lobe will not be connected to as quickly as possible. And so they're going to have a harder time making decisions. So I think that that's one of the key things that I know that I've always emphasized too, is making this very much about them, when you're having that conversation about, let's talk about your brain and how you are impacting its potential. And we all just want you to have the best brain possible with the most potential to make better choices. And many kids, like I said, they don't love their impulsive brain. When you think back to your, childhood too, it's kind of an awkward time. You're more emotional. And that's another piece of the brain part too, that substance use makes your amygdala stay large, all those types of things, that you're more emotional. And they don't love it. They don't know any different because they're young, but they don't love it. So it's like making sure that they understand that what you don't like about your brain right now, you don't want for the rest of your life. So let's give it the best opportunity we can for growth and development to help you be a more productive adult.
So as caring adults, as we start to move towards making sure that our kids and our care, that we are in our sphere of involvement, we really want to make sure they have the best chance of fulfilling their potential possible. And so this is really important information because it seems like a new conversation. It's like, we used to not have seatbelts in cars. And I know Mary Beth Trainer has said before, it's just like we wear helmets when we go biking now. That this is new information is that, look, even if you believe in the use of marijuana, delay the use until that adolescent brain can develop, to make sure they don't get arrested development or lost potential from the use of drugs.
Right. Because not that I want any adolescent to smoke marijuana or, anybody until, whatever, when it's legal or whatever under those type of circumstances. But an 18-year-old smoking marijuana is better than a 14-year-old smoking marijuana. A 20-year-old smoking marijuana is better than a 16-year-old. So not that I'm saying it's okay for college age kids, but again, giving the brain the best opportunity to develop as much as possible without stunting that growth is important. And that's why when you talk about having a younger conversation and that we're seeing 12-year-olds smoking marijuana, that's a very stunted brain then, if starting at 12.
Well, and I had read recently that one of the best determinants of how your child will, as a concerned parent, react to challenging circumstances is how you as a parent do it. So the role of modeling is really important. They're picking up more than just what we're communicating. So, part of this is, Nicole, what about, so alcohol, it's prevalent in our communities, and parents, there's always differing opinions about what's acceptable. What are some of your key insights as it pertains to giving our kids the best chance at fulfilling their future and a bright future when it comes to what do we want to normalize or not normalize around alcohol?
Well, and I like how you led into that conversation about, about modeling. It's like, I don't believe that parents, can't ever, have a beer at their home. But I would caution parents about having I had such a terrible day, I need a drink. Because what you're modeling with that conversation is that alcohol takes away that stress. And so when we're seeing kids that are using substances, my first question to them all the time is, so what is so bad about how you feel? What is so bad about how you feel that you need to use a substance in order to change that feeling? And so it's the same that goes for like parents, what is it when you have a bad day? Kind of caution yourself on that language and how you attach emotions to substance use as far as alcohol goes. That would be my biggest advice, is watch your body language. Now, ideally, if you want to partake in, not being around your kids doing so, that might not be the reality and how that works, but just being sure that you're watching what you say about it and what the purpose of it is. And because or else I think we model that this is how we get through a rough time in our lives, is it helps us. So yeah, that's about the alcohol thing. The other thing, just to kind of emphasize about what kids need to understand too, is that most people who never drank alcohol or used a substance prior to them becoming legal, like 21, the likelihood of them becoming addicted is extremely decreased, because the other part of the adolescent brain is alcohol and marijuana affect their brains very differently. Alcohol, particularly in an adolescent brain, really triggers their pleasure sensors. So they get a different effect of alcohol than adults do. It's almost like more of a euphoric effect, whereas adults get more of that depressant effect. And so, because it's such a positive euphoric effect for an adolescent, their brain continues to seek that out. And so, if they're doing a lot of drinking when they're younger, when they become 21, their brain will still respond with a more euphoric effect. So, then they are more likely to become an alcoholic, because their brains were wired to enjoy alcohol better.
Well, that really it makes me think of the power of routines. And, if we're modeling this, making sure that we're doing the best within kids in our care to start to have the conversation when they're young. That's a message. When they're older, it's more of a conversation. You can lock them in their minivan like you've done
Mhm.
and facilitate a good conversation. The importance of understanding that we want to delay this because the adolescent brain needs time to develop, and we don't want to stunt potential or get arrested development of a developing brain. And then this idea of, how we're living really impacts, the decisions that our kids are making around us. And whatever routines get cemented, that can create a vicious cycle of emotion and drug use, or a, negative emotion comes in and negative decision.
Mhm. The other thing is, the modeling of the behavior is more and more, I hear more and more parents talking about, um, well, I mean, we let them drink, but only at the lake. Okay. Well, kids don't have that ability. So when you permit something, in their brains, you've permitted the behavior. So if they're at a family wedding and you're like, oh, drink away, do, whatever, we're at a family wedding, or we're at the lake, of course, go grab a beer or two. You're giving them permission. And in their brain, that's what they're going to register, is that alcohol is okay and I have permission. So, and I usually say this kind of to like my personal friends, you can't punish what you've permitted. And so be careful about that. If you've permitted a behavior, you can't then really backtrack and be like, now I'm going to punish you. So you have to have a better conversation about that. And it should be just a matter of, illegal or legal. And so even if it's legal, I mean, I had a personal situation where, people going to Wisconsin, for example, and Wisconsin being like, at 16, you can drink if you're with your parent. And I said to my friends, I'm like, I don't care if it's legal or not. You should not be allowing that, because it's not about legal, it's not about power, it's not about control. And that's what I always say to kids that I work with. This isn't a bunch of adults who just came up with the kids should not drink until they're 21. I'm going to talk to you about why that is. It's not just about power and control and trying to stunt your fun. It's because if we can keep you from drinking until you're 21, then your brain is going to be better able to handle that and not have an addictive problem down the road. So parents need to be really careful about that permitting of the drinking, even in a safe environment, because it's not about them being safe. It's not about them not drinking and driving. I mean, obviously those are concerns, but it's about the brain. And the brain can't differentiate between whether you only drank at the lake or whether you drank at a party. The brain processes that alcohol no matter where you're at.
Well, and as we continue to sort of, face new challenges, we need the brightest people we possibly can. And what parent doesn't want the brightest future possible for their young one? And so knowing this is really important. So just like we wear a bike helmet when we go biking, drugs and alcohol, we delay the use of them because we want your brain to be fully developed. And we don't want you to fall into that risk of delaying how you develop. Question from somebody in our community community is, what's the most common answer you see with kids and teens give to the question about what's so bad about how you feel? You know, that's a really insightful question you provided us, which is not just about drugs or alcohol. It's what's driving the decision to use it.
I would say anxiety. I think a lot of kids say that, especially marijuana, it just makes them, um, they feel like it makes them more chill. And that I think there's a lot of stuff going on in the media about, medical marijuana and the legalization of marijuana and what it treats them. And the reality is that for kids with anxiety, marijuana does help temporarily. So it's having that conversation about, and I saw that Dr. Hanish is going to be on the next one, which is fantastic. That's her wheelhouse. But the thing about treating anxiety in an adolescent with marijuana is you're not going to fix the anxiety. Whereas prescription medication can actually rewire your brain to grow out of anxiety. Marijuana will never do that. Marijuana will maybe temporarily mask the symptoms, but it will never treat the issue. So it's that a lot of just the pressures, they feel like it just makes them um, sneak away for a little bit of reality in regards to that. And so it's really kind of focusing in on that and making sure that they understand that there's healthy legal ways to deal with those same emotions, and that those, making sure that they understand. Like I'll say to a kid, so you smoked weed all week because you were stressed out about school. Did that make school go better? Well, no. Okay, so that didn't work for you. It's all about kids are very goal orientated and very they have a purpose for all their behaviors. So the way you counteract that is, so when you smoke weed, your anxiety went away temporarily. Did your anxiety get better? Well, no. Well, that didn't work for you. So let's try something different. It's having those conversations, but definitely about how they feel, a lot of anxiety.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned, and on the next webinar, we'll be visiting with Dr. Hash, and we can talk more about anxiety. But that's an interesting thing to note, because in your over 25 years of experience working with adolescents, what are some of the shifts that you see? So parents now in this modern age, what are you seeing when they're coming through the juvenile court system? Any changes over the last 5-10 years of what today's landscape looks like versus a decade ago?
I think as far as in working with the kids, I mean, kids are kids. I mean, I don't think that kids' brains have changed a whole lot. Obviously they're still having the same pressures and the same responsibilities and all of that type of stuff. What I see a shift in is more of a societal or parental acceptance of certain substances, which is very concerning to me. I think that when we entered the opioid crisis, we definitely saw an increase of parents being like, "Oh, well, at least they're just smoking weed," and I get that from a standpoint of about death and overdose, and I get all that. But weed is just as damaging as far as their future and their development. And marijuana actually is even more so damaging to brains and their development than some of the harder drugs. Medically speaking, the harder drugs, yes, they're more addictive, they're more dangerous and that type of stuff, but definitely more of just an acceptance of marijuana usage and drinking, I think, is definitely a shift that I have seen at juvenile court.
Well, and this is another question from our community, but when it comes to having these discussions or sharing these messages when they're younger, is there anything that we shouldn't do or should avoid when we're having these discussions?
Well, I think definitely the scared straight, it's like, even I always, when I talk about the scared straight, I always think of the movie Mean Girls, and maybe I'm dating myself, but the whole, if you have sex, you will get gonorrhea and then you'll die, that type of stuff. And I think it's important for them to understand the dangers of drugs as far as drinking and driving and car accidents and that type of stuff, but making it very personal. I think that What we need to avoid is talking about them, talking about they, talking about people that you've heard about, and really focusing in on them. Kids are very self-centered. And if you have children, you know this. Kids worry about me, myself, and I. And so you have to make it be about them and be like, ask them about what their goals are, what their hopes are, and how substances could affect that from a brain standpoint and development standpoint. Making sure that they just understand personally how this can affect them and how this can work for them. Just try to avoid the, the scared straight and the, if you drink and drive, you're going to get a DUI and then you're going to lose your license. And because they don't believe any of that's going to really happen to them. So it has to be more of, here's what it's going to do to your brain. I feel like the brain conversation with kids has been the most important and impactful technique that I've used, because it's no longer a matter of, well, if I don't get caught. Well, your brain doesn't care if the police catch you smoking weed. It's your brain's got weed in it. So it's universal, and this is how it's going to go. And don't brush off like a conversation. Kids will drop hints all the time. And so what not to do is, if a kid says, oh yeah, my friend Susie, she got busted last night. Don't just shrug that off and be like, oh, sucks to be Susie, right? I mean, you need to be like, well, tell me about that. What happened with that? How do you feel about that? Why do you think Susie did that? What's going on with her? Is there, opening up that conversation that your kids feel like they can come to you. The other thing is, they're kids, they're adolescents. I guarantee every one of your children or my children are going to at some point make a bad choice. And how you respond to that bad choice is going to be critical. If you freak out and you start screaming and yelling, and they'll never talk to you about it again. It's like having that conversation of, explain to me what happened. And when you say, explain to me what happened, don't let them be like, well, I went to this party and got busted. Okay. That's not explaining what happened. Be like, explain to me what the thought process was. Explain to me what led up to this. Explain to me how you were feeling. Explain to me what you were thinking. Really understanding the motivation of what drove them to their usage is going to be critical for you to try to understand what's going on with your adolescent.
Well, I think this is tremendously helpful for all of us that are trying to figure out how to start this conversation with, adolescents. And I think maybe two buckets. So, things that we can preemptively do, and then things about how we react or respond. And, I think this idea of the brain, the idea of getting an image of lost potential is something we can understand, especially if you're a teenager where your brain is still developing and you're concerned about your own universe. So keying in on, we would like you not to make that decision, because it will take away from your opportunities, from your potential. And then being prepared to respond with, if this surfaces, so you're in the van and somebody says something about weed, that you're ready to have some of those conversations. And so those are two really great things for us to prepare for as we, become parents and coaches and educators, to be ready to share those messages about the brain. Just like you need to wear a helmet to ride a bike, like delaying the use of drugs and alcohol is going to help you to get your brain fully formed, and it is going to be less likely that you get a dependency. But it's more than that. It's reaching your potential. And then that if they do bring this up, that we respond well. So responding well, I really keyed into on your asking them about how they feel and walking through their thought process. So, what would you like to say, Nicole, to the parents that are on this now, or will be watching the replay, that are having a struggle around this issue? So they've got an adolescent son or daughter that's making some destructive decisions, and they're already down that path, or they're concerned that it's there. What would you like to tell them?
Well, I think that, again, just opening up that dialogue. I mean, even if you're in a position where you're like, oh, shoot, I probably should have been talking about this and not ignoring this, having an opportunity to just say to them, so I would just start the conversation. It's like, so I'm aware that we're having kind of a substance problem. So let's talk about that. And what do we need to do to get you the help that you need? And so when I have kids who will say to me, it's like, well, I don't need any treatment, or I don't need to talk to anybody. It's like, okay, well, then prove it, right? I mean, so let's talk about that. So if you're just doing this for fun, then we shouldn't have a problem not using anymore. But opening the door to the kids, being like, my goal as a parent is for you not to use substances. You as a child need to help me understand how we get there. So letting them provide you the feedback, like what do we need to do together to end the substance use? To explain to them the brain science, to be like, this is about me being concerned about your future and your development. And so how do we get there together? Let them lead the way. Like what do you need from me as a parent? Do you need to go to treatment? Do you need to talk to somebody? Do we need to see a doctor about some mental health stuff? You tell me, but the bottom line is that substance use will not be tolerated. And so I want to help you get to that point. Those kids that are super far down the line, I have a lot of parents who say to me, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And I'm like, I get it. You can't be with them 24 hours a day, but you can make their life pretty miserable until they realize that the substance isn't worth the misery. And if they're still willing to use, even though you've taken away their car, you've taken away their phone, you've taken away everything that's important to them. If they're still willing to use, then you have a child with a problem. And you really need to seek out some treatment for that child. Because if they are willing to use despite losing everything that's important, now we're moving into some pretty concerning behaviors.
Well, thank you for that, and excellent advice. Another question from our community is about technology and the use of smartphones as an addiction. Is this on par with traditional substances? And what's your view on technology in adolescence?
I would say that the only thing that's been brought to juvenile court's attention as far as addiction and technology, and not necessarily smartphones, it's definitely more of like video games. And we have a lot of kids who will be truant and missing school, and it causes a lot of fights in homes and that type of stuff with video games. And again, I cannot stress enough that the video game rules should start the day they got their video console. So if you have an 8-year-old who gets a PlayStation and you say, okay, you can play this 1 hour a day, you've now laid the foundation that this is not a free-for-all device for them. And so the earlier that you lay down the rules, saying like when they get a smartphone, be like, here's how this is going to work. You will have your Life 360 app on. You will. And it just starts from day one, because then no longer does it become a punishment, because they'll view it as a punishment if you limit their time and you've never limited it before. So it's very important to start that very young and to lay those foundations down.
Well, and that connects to another question we have from the community. Video games and what we do as kids and what our kids are doing. A lot of that has to do with fitting in and being cool. And what advice do you have to parents to give to their kids to just navigate their peers? How do we give them some tools when they're in a situation that they find themselves where they could be making a bad decision or just not doing what everybody's doing to make a better decision? What are some tools and ways we can have that conversation with them to help them steer with their peers?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that they need to figure out who they are. And so helping them figure out, like, who are you as a person and what are your goals as a person? Like, describe to me the kids, and I'll say, like, describe to me the kids that you want to look cool to. So when they describe them, then I'll be like, is that who you want to be? And oftentimes it's not. It's this false perception that they're the cool kids. But when they understand who they are, and I'll be like, okay, so tell me somebody that you look up to and why. And then they'll describe that person. And I'll be like, are there those people in your school? Well, why don't we try to be cool and fit in with them? How can we navigate that? And it's this whole, I think it's this false sense of that it makes you cool. And unfortunately, sometimes the kids that are making the bad choices are the most likely to accept people into a peer group. It's kind of that misery loves company. They don't feel that good about themselves. So they kind of bring other kids into that peer group. But again, not making it be about their friends. So I say to kids all the time, this is not about good kids, bad kids. This is about all kids. And some kids make good choices and some kids make bad choices, but there's no such thing as a bad kid. So maybe trying to get them to be more of like the leader. It's like, how about you be the cool kid? You be the cool kid whose brain's developing. You be the cool kid who's getting good grades. Let's make all of that kind of cool again. And this doesn't help you fit in. And do you want it? Do you want to fit in with that peer group? Is that where you want to be labeled? And so again, it's like, I'll say to kids, if you hang out with skunks long enough, at some point you smell like one. So do we want to be hanging out with peers that are not promoting us to be a positive person? Like, you want to surround yourself with people who elevate your potential.
And it really seems like one of the ways we can be very effective of making sure that our kids, make good choices is that, you've laid us groundwork for us in helping them to navigate their life, and so when they're making a destructive decision or you're worried that they are, walking them through their own thought process, well, that's a real gift to us that are viewing this of an approach that we can take, is to not rush in and try to save this situation or to condemn it right off the bat, is to work with them. And even the expression of care to know where they're coming from, that is moving them closer to probably making less destructive decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to understand the why. There's, if you walk away with one thing as a parent, you have to understand the why and what drove the behavior in order to help them through it.
Yeah. Another thing, I know you get this one a lot, but kids asking their mom or dad, well, did you ever do drugs or did you drink when you were my age? And what's your response for when that question comes up?
Well, I always say, the response to the kids should be this, or, to your own kids or to whoever's, people ask me all the time as a court officer, it's like, oh, it's like, I always just say, you know what? I had an adolescent brain once too. I had a brain that didn't process information very quickly. Did that brain cause me to make some bad choices? It sure did. And now when I reflect back on it, I'm like, wow, I wish I wouldn't have done those things. I really wish that somebody when I was your age, I wish somebody understood the effects of certain things on my brain. And I wish that I would have had the information that science is now giving to you to provide you a much better opportunity. And as a child, many adults made poor choices. And by the grace of a higher power, we're still here based on some of those choices. I want better for you. I want a fully developed brain for you. I will never disclose usage history to a kid. I will never disclose like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, we had a kegger and that kind of stuff. No, I don't think that that's necessary. But I also don't think that you should say it's none of your business either. You have to have that conversation of course I was a kid once and made some poor choices.
Well, and what a great line too is just, I want better for you. And then shifting it back on this conversation of the brain, which I think is one of several of the real gifts you've given us today, Nicole, is this idea of just, let's focus on your potential, you making good choices. Your brain is still developing. We want to protect that so that you can reach your full potential. And we really don't want to limit that. We do have a question from the community, which is about personality types, and are more personality types more susceptible to different types of substances? So as concerns adults, are we should be looking at hyper kids and them getting attached to Ritalin or something of that nature, or to alcohol or pot because they want to slow themselves down. Just, our kids, is there any sort of pattern to this from their behavior and what we should maybe be looking out for?
I would actually say no. I don't think that substances discriminate, as far as, by race, financial background or personality types. Everybody uses for different reasons. And that's why it's so important to figure out the personal reason. You can't assume that a hyper kid is using just to kind of, chill out a little bit. You have to understand that each person has their own individual reason for doing what they're doing. But I'd say no. I mean, I don't think that there's a type. It's people are always like, oh, I suppose you work with parents who, are just terrible parents. And I go, well, yeah, I mean, I work with some parents who maybe aren't doing the most effective parenting, but I've worked with some pretty darn awesome parents too, who are doing everything possible. It is just, it's a bad thing. I mean, it's like, and every kid can get wrapped up into it. And I think that's important for everybody to understand that it's not this shameful thing. If you've got a kid who's using, it's not like this personal failure on you as a parent. It's just understanding that it can happen to anybody.
Well, and do you have any advice around that issue? So, I've heard that in the addiction community before, that the guilt and shame as a parent can be really overwhelming. And so, what things can we say to those parents, in addition to, they don't need to feel that way, but what advice do you have for us as a community to sort of support each other that are going through that challenge?
I think it's really important to just be okay to admit things. I think that parents get defensive, obviously for various reasons, to be like, and I have teenagers, and your immediate instinct is, what did I do wrong? And instead of making it be about right and wrong, be like, what can I now do different? What can I do to derail this? Because if you've had a kid who's been using from 14 to 17 and they stop, great. You have 5 more years of brain development. It's never too late. It's never too late to throw your hands up in the air and be like, ugh, we're too far down this path. And so it's to acknowledge, like, gosh, yeah, maybe I should have done something when I knew they were 14. But you have 2 choices. You can either wallow in your self-pity of, oops, I screwed up and I didn't address this, or you can, buck up and, okay, let's start over here. Let's dive in here and let's do something different. So you don't get to give up as a parent. And so unfortunately, sometimes I have to have that conversation with parents too. I'm not letting you give up, because I never give up on a kid. And that's why I work in juvenile court, is I can understand 16-year-olds making poor choices. I struggle with 40-year-olds making poor choices. So that's why I don't do adult probation. But you can't give up. And they just have to know that even if they're 20 years old and in college, that you love them and that you're there for them and that you'll support them. And letting them know that you're disappointed in their choices, but that doesn't change how I feel about you.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, and how about, some stories of hope, or just some, maybe just letting us know that there is hope? I mean, have you, in your experience, seen kids turn around? Is that likely? What are some things we could look at to say, look, it's not always when they make a destructive decision that it's going to end in despair.
Right. We have, like, our recidivism rate is, we have probably less than 20% of kids who will reoffend. We have a wide variety of what we call like the one and dones, right? And so they kind of get caught. Kids by nature have an invincibility complex. And so they think they're not going to get caught and they're not going to get in trouble. So then when they do, they kind of have this aha moment. The other thing that I think that we get too wrapped up into is like, success and like failure. And I look at a kid who was like chronically using, that we get him to a really good place. And then 3 months down the road, he slips and calls me up and is like, oh, Nicole, I screwed up. Okay. To me, that's a success, right? Because he's willing to talk about it and he's willing to process it and he's willing to talk about what went into it. Now on paper, is that a failure? Yeah, it's a usage. But having that open conversation. And I think that's the key for parents too. It's like, if you have a kid who's been dabbling in substances and they screw up, because guess what? They're going to screw up. They're kids, right? And so not viewing like, oh, here we go again. Johnny went out drinking. Here we go again. And freaking out. If they come to you and are like, Mom, Dad, I screwed up. Wow. That is progress. Opening up that dialogue, having that conversation, just, being able to just talk about all of those types of things, is you have to view what success is. And so we have successes all the time. I have kids that were on my probation caseload at 26 that call me up and are like, hey, I decided to go back to college. What's a FAFSA? And it's like, great, let's talk about that. Those things are wonderful. And, some of the kids who hated my guts, when they come back and their brains are developed, and have those conversations, you're like, okay, I planted a seed. And I know that I've shared, like, my best quote is for working in juvenile court. And, as a parent too, it's like, we're just planting seeds of trees whose shade we may never enjoy. And so that's the piece of this, is making sure that you're having every opportunity you can to plant a seed. You may not know when that seed is going to flourish, but at some point they might remember that.
Wow, that's really beautifully said. Nicole, one thought that comes to mind is, you've explained that the adolescent brain, they are invincible. They think they can really take these risks and never get caught. Also, they're selfish, they're really concerned about their world. And that if you use substances at an earlier age, before you're in your 20s, that you can end up, not fully developing your brain. It makes me think that we might have quite a few adults out there that are invincible and pretty selfish, that maybe are really using a lot of substances as
correct.
Kids.
When I talk to adult probation agents, they say 98% of their caseload used substances when they were adolescents. And so their brains are still like an adolescent doing risky, stupid things.
So we're on a mission to not let this happen. Just like we didn't wear bike helmets, we do now. We don't use substances until we're in our 20s, and maybe then not at all, because you're already making healthier choices. Well, we're on our final 10 minutes. And so, Nicole, I'm going to try something a little bit new. I'm going to go through some of what we've covered, some of the high points, and then you tell me, add your commentary or change if we didn't get something right. You can start talking about drugs and alcohol and substances at a young age. And it's not always a direct conversation when they're younger, it's messaging. And we also, in addition to messaging, need to be concerned about how we model our behavior, being sure that when we come in, we don't say, oh, I'm stressed, I need a drink. We don't want to tie emotions to this. When they get a little older, we can use the old Nicole minivan trick and lock them in and say, I heard somebody say marijuana, let's talk about it. That we bring up these things to make sure that we are prepared to help guide them to make good decisions, but also that we're prepared to respond well when they bring these things up. And that what we're really looking to do is to help them make decisions. And so we want to make sure to ask why they're thinking that, where they're going, what they'd like to be, and focus all of these discussions around their potential and their developing brain. And even if they ask about if you did substances or you caused something, say, I want better for you, and we want to see your full brain utilized. So after that summary, Nicole, final thoughts and things to add and change to that.
No, I think that covered it. I think just, the emphasizing that this is not a conversation. This is 30-second sound bites every opportunity you have with your child. I think that people get real stressed out about, I need to have the drug talk. Your kid's not going to listen to you. Adolescents, they have the brain span of possibly 5 minutes. You probably have like 5 minutes to really make an impact with them, and then they're pretty much done with you. So just every opportunity you get, when you talk about the minivan, listen to the music they're listening to, and then they'll come up with some horrible thing in this music, and you're like, whoa, let's talk about that, because the topic arose. So listen to what they're saying. Be attentive. You know, I think that, you know, Level Up did a really good job of handing out, you know, information to parents. You know, it's like your presence is their present, being present and listening to them. And the other piece, if I could emphasize one thing, and I preach about this a lot, is the part of the adolescent brain is the frontal lobe is the brakes. Okay. They don't have great brakes in their car. So you as parents and caregivers have to be their brakes. I can't stress enough that you need to set rules and boundaries, and you have to have a curfew. You have to be home. I have to know where you're at, because their brains aren't wired that way to necessarily make the best choices.
Wow, that's what a great way to end this segment, because we need to be the brakes for our kids, and and to express care and concern for them is one of the ways that we open up a dialogue that we're going to have with them to make sure they reach their full potential. Nicole, this has been an absolute delight to visit with you, and you've given us so many practical things. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah. And anybody, if you ever want to just reach out to me, I'm at Juvenile Court. You can contact anytime. I answer questions from parents who want to talk more personally about their children anytime. Give me a call. We'll try to brainstorm and work through it together.
Well, and Nicole, thank you so much for modeling to us how to do this. I mean, you have such positivity and enthusiasm to help us navigate this situation. So hopefully we're going to help a whole lot of people delay the use of substances among adolescents and create a brighter future for them and all of us. Well, for all of you, thank you for joining or watching this. It's our first episode, but our next episode is going to be Thursday, December 3rd. That's at noon. And they're always going to be the first Thursday of the month. And we're going to dive in with Dr. Hanish and Mary Beth Trainer. We're going to talk about psychology, and we're going to hear about a personal story. It's something you will not want to miss. So bring your questions, invite your friends, and let's continue the discussion to make sure that we create a bright future for our kids and for our region and beyond. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you the first Thursday in December.